The morning started out peaceful, the kind of quiet weekend morning that most people look forward to after a busy week. The sun was warm but not too strong, and the parking lot outside the supermarket had a lazy, relaxed feeling. Families were walking in and out of the store. A few kids were laughing near the shopping carts, and the smell of fresh bread drifted out from the bakery section near the entrance. Among the customers that morning was a woman named Alicia Turner. She wasn't just any shopper. She was a senior officer in the Army, someone who had spent more than 20 years serving her country. But today she wasn't wearing her uniform. She had on a simple blue shirt, a pair of jeans, and comfortable shoes. The only thing that might give away her military background was the small service cap she wore out of habit, a symbol of pride and discipline that had become a part of her. Alicia had come to the supermarket to pick up a few groceries before meeting a friend for lunch. She walked slowly down the aisles, checking her list on her phone. She smiled politely at an elderly man reaching for a cereal box and helped a young mother grab a bag of rice from the top shelf. That was just the kind of person she was, calm, polite, and always willing to help. When she reached the checkout counter, she chatted lightly with the cashier, a teenager who looked nervous but smiled when Alicia complimented her on her earrings. The world outside the automatic doors looked peaceful. The air smelled faintly of rain, and a soft breeze moved through the parking lot. Alicia loaded her grocery bags into her cart and began walking toward her car, parked near the far end of the lot. She didn't notice the police car parked a few spaces away. Inside sat Officer Bradley Henson, a man in his early 40s who had been with the department for several years. He sat with one arm resting on the steering wheel, sipping coffee from a disposable cup. The shift had been slow and boredom had begun to creep in. He had received a vague report on the radio about a suspicious individual wearing a cap and moving around the parking lot. It wasn't even clear what the suspicion was. Someone had simply made a call. Instead of verifying the details, Officer Henson started scanning the area with mild irritation. When his eyes landed on Alicia, who was loading groceries into the trunk of her car, his mind made a quick assumption. He didn't stop to think that the report might have been exaggerated or that she looked like any other shopper. Alicia, unaware of being watched, lifted the last bag of groceries into her trunk and paused for a second to fix her cap. It was one of those small, unconscious gestures she often did, a quiet sign of discipline. She was about to return her cart when she noticed the police cruiser slowly rolling closer. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police cars often drove around shopping centers, keeping an eye on things. But when the car stopped directly behind her vehicle and the officer stepped out, her sense of ease faded just a little. "Good morning, officer," she said politely as he approached. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're doing here?" His tone wasn't exactly rude, but it wasn't friendly either. Alicia blinked, confused. "Just shopping," she said, gesturing toward her grocery bags. "Is something wrong?" "I got a report about someone acting suspicious in this parking lot," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mind showing me some identification?" The words caught her off guard. She looked around. People were walking by with shopping bags, getting into cars, minding their own business. Nothing about her stood out except maybe her small military cap. She felt a sudden, uncomfortable tightness in her chest. "Of course," she said softly, "but may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Henson crossed his arms. "Like I said, there was a report. Just doing my job." Alicia nodded, trying to stay calm. She had dealt with tense situations before, far worse than this. But there was something unsettling about the way he looked at her, as if he'd already decided she didn't belong there. She opened her handbag slowly to take out her wallet. At that moment, a small group of people exited the store behind them. One of them, a middle-aged woman, paused for a second, sensing the tension. Alicia kept her voice steady. "I'm a serving officer," she said. "Here's my military ID," Henson's tone sharpened. "Let's not make sudden movements, ma'am." That surprised her. She froze, her hand hovering over her bag. "I'm just getting my ID," she said quietly. He didn't relax. "Step back from the car, please." The woman from the store frowned and whispered something to her companion. A few others nearby began to slow down, sensing something wasn't right. Alicia raised her hand slightly to show she meant no harm. "Officer," she said calmly, "you're misunderstanding me. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just—" "Ma'am, please follow my instructions," he interrupted. The tone in his voice made her stomach tighten. She had commanded soldiers in difficult missions, negotiated under fire, and led teams in stressful conditions, but this felt different. This was her own country, her own town, and yet she felt like she was being treated as a threat for simply existing. The breeze had died down, and the parking lot suddenly felt heavy with silence. A cart rolled by, its wheels squeaking loudly. Alicia stood still, her hands slightly raised as Henson continued to question her. "Where are you coming from? What's in those bags?" She took a breath, forcing her voice to stay even. "Groceries. From the supermarket. You can check if you like. Why are you wearing that hat?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "It's part of my service uniform," she said. "I'm in the army." He tilted his head, skepticism clear in his eyes. "You got proof of that?" Her patience was starting to thin, but she reminded herself of her training. Stay composed, don't escalate. She gave a small nod. "Yes, my identification is in my bag. May I reach for it slowly?" There was a pause. The officer didn't respond right away, and Alicia could sense the tension growing. Two bystanders had stopped at a safe distance, watching quietly. One of them took out a phone, pretending to check messages but clearly recording the exchange. Inside, Alicia's mind was steady but alert. She'd seen this kind of misunderstanding spiral out of control before. Not here, but in other contexts where fear and authority collided. She wanted to believe this would end quickly, that once she showed her ID, the officer would apologize, and they'd both move on. "Go ahead," he finally said, his tone still hard. Alicia reached slowly into her bag and pulled out her wallet. Her hands didn't shake, but her heart was beating a little faster. She took out the ID card and held it up for him to see. "This is my official identification," she said. "You can verify it with the Department of Defense." Henson glanced at it but didn't immediately take it. Instead, he looked at her again, studying her face as if trying to decide whether to believe her. A car alarm went off somewhere in the distance, making both of them flinch slightly. The sudden sound broke the tension for a brief moment, but not enough. Alicia took a careful step back. "Is there a problem with my identification, officer?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. He just muttered something under his breath and finally looked at the ID. His eyes scanned the name and rank printed clearly on the card. For a few seconds, he didn't say anything. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "You could have mentioned that earlier." "I did," she said calmly. The tone of his voice had changed, but the damage was already done. People had seen. A few were whispering, others shaking their heads. The woman who had been recording lowered her phone slowly, her expression one of quiet disbelief. Alicia didn't say anything more. She simply waited, holding her ID card, her posture straight but not aggressive. Inside, though, she felt a mix of sadness and exhaustion. She had served overseas, faced dangerous situations, and represented her country with honor. Yet here, in a supermarket parking lot, she had been treated like a suspect for no reason. Finally, Henson mumbled something about just checking and took a step back. "You can go, ma'am." Alicia nodded once, slipping her ID back into her wallet. She didn't respond, didn't argue. She simply turned and closed the trunk of her car. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She placed her hands on the steering wheel and sat quietly for a few seconds, letting her heartbeat return to normal. Around her, life in the parking lot returned to normal. Carts rolling, doors closing, conversations continuing. But for Alicia, the calm felt different now. Something about that moment had changed her. She wasn't angry, not yet, just deeply aware of how fragile respect could be, and how quickly assumptions could turn an ordinary morning into something unsettling. As she started the engine, she looked briefly in the rearview mirror and saw the officer walking back to his cruiser. She wondered if he realized the weight of what had just happened. Probably not, she thought. To him, it might have been just another stop. But to her, it was a reminder of how easily dignity could be questioned, and how important it was to stay calm even when the world around you lost balance. She drove away slowly, her face steady, her mind already moving toward the lesson that moment would carry. A lesson that, before long, the entire town would come to witness. The drive home was quiet, but Alicia's mind wasn't. She kept replaying the moment in the parking lot over and over again. The sound of the officer's voice, the way he had looked at her, the disbelief in his eyes when she said she was a senior officer, it all stayed with her. She wasn't angry at first, not really. It was more like a dull ache, a feeling of being unseen in a world she had given so much to protect. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, the groceries shifting in the back seat as she drove. The radio played softly, but she barely heard the music. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the scene. How calm she had stayed. How easily things could have gone wrong if she had panicked or raised her voice. Years of discipline and training had taught her how to remain steady under pressure. That calmness had probably saved her from something much worse. When she reached home, she parked her car and sat in silence for a while before getting out. Her neighborhood was quiet. Tree-lined streets, children's bikes leaning against fences, the sound of a dog barking in the distance. She carried her bags inside and set them on the counter. The house felt still, peaceful even, but that uneasy feeling in her chest refused to go away. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring out at the fading sunlight. She had always believed in fairness and respect in doing the right thing, but moments like the one she had just experienced tested that belief. She had been in uniform most of her life. She had led soldiers, trained cadets, and earned the respect of people who understood duty. Yet today, dressed like an ordinary woman, she had been treated with suspicion simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the next morning, she decided to move on. She told herself it was just one person's ignorance, not a reflection of everyone. She didn't even plan to report it. But life has a strange way of bringing the truth into the light when it's meant to be seen. What Alicia didn't know was that someone in the parking lot had filmed the entire incident from start to finish. A young woman named Clara had captured the moment when the officer first approached, and she had continued recording when the tone shifted from questioning to tense. Clara hadn't meant to cause a scene, she just felt something wasn't right. That evening, unsure of what to do, she shared the video online with a short caption. This woman handled herself with calm and grace. No one deserves to be treated this way. Within hours, the video began spreading. At first, it circulated among locals, people who shopped at the same supermarket, people who recognized Alicia from community events or military ceremonies. Then it reached wider circles. By the next afternoon, it had gathered thousands of views and people started commenting, "She's an Army officer. This is unacceptable. Why is this still happening?" Alicia found out about the video 2 days later when a friend from her unit called. "Did something happen at the supermarket?" the friend asked gently. Alicia paused, surprised. "How do you know about that?" "It's online," her friend said. "There's a video. People are talking about it." Alicia opened her laptop and searched for it. Within seconds, she found herself watching the exact moment that had unsettled her. Seeing it from another angle made her realize how tense the situation really looked, how quickly things had escalated, even though she had remained calm the entire time. She watched her own steady posture, the careful way she spoke, and the unease in the crowd around them. She closed her eyes for a moment. She hadn't wanted attention. She had just wanted to shop for groceries and go home like everyone else. But now the story had taken on a life of its own. Meanwhile, inside the local police department, things were far less calm. The video had reached the chief's office within a day. Reporters were starting to call, asking for statements. The department had to respond before rumors spread any further. Officer Bradley Henson, the man from the video, was called in for questioning. He walked into the chief's office with a stiff posture and nervous energy. "Bradley," the chief said, his tone heavy, "I've seen the footage." Henson shifted uncomfortably. "Chief, I was responding to a call. Someone reported suspicious activity. I was just doing my job." The chief leaned back in his chair. Doing your job doesn't mean intimidating a citizen in broad daylight, especially not a decorated Army officer. Henson frowned. "I didn't know who she was." "That's the point," the chief said firmly. "You didn't ask. You assumed. And now this department is on the front page of every local paper." The officer didn't respond. He looked down at the floor, his jaw tight. Outside the department, community members had already begun organizing discussions about fairness and respect. Local leaders called for accountability. Military officials from Alicia's base reached out privately, offering their support. They praised her composure and emphasized how dangerous that situation could have become if she hadn't stayed calm. For Alicia, the attention felt overwhelming. She didn't like the spotlight, especially when it came from something so personal. She had built her reputation on quiet leadership, not headlines or controversy. But now her phone kept ringing. Journalists wanted interviews, neighbors wanted to express their support, and strangers sent her messages of encouragement. One message stood out. It came from a mother who wrote, "My teenage daughter watched your video and said she learned what strength looks like. Thank you for staying calm. You reminded us all how to face fear with dignity." That message made Alicia pause. Maybe this story wasn't just about her anymore. Maybe it was about something bigger, about how people treat one another when power and misunderstanding collide. A few days later, Alicia was invited to speak with community leaders and police representatives at a small town meeting. She didn't want to accuse or humiliate anyone. She just wanted to talk, calmly, openly, about what had happened and what could be learned from it. When she arrived at the community center, the room was packed. Cameras were there, but she ignored them. Her focus was on the faces of ordinary people: teachers, parents, students, officers in uniform. Some looked angry, some just curious, but most looked ready to listen. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly, holding the microphone with steady hands. Her voice was clear and calm, just as it had been that morning in the parking lot. "I'm not here to point fingers," she said. "I'm here because what happened to me could happen to anyone. I want us to ask why." The room was silent. "I've worn a uniform for most of my life," she continued. "It teaches you discipline, responsibility, and respect. But respect isn't something that comes from a badge or a rank. It comes from how we see one another, how we listen before we act." I stayed calm that morning because I've seen what happens when fear takes over. I didn't want that for either of us. People nodded quietly. A few clapped softly. Even some of the officers present lowered their heads, reflecting on her words. Meanwhile, Officer Henson sat at the back of the room, listening. He hadn't planned to come, but curiosity around and guilt had brought him there. As she spoke, something shifted inside him. He didn't want to admit it, but her calmness made him feel small. Embarrassed even. He realized how quickly he had judged her that morning, and how differently it could have gone if she hadn't kept her composure. After the meeting ended, Alicia stepped outside to catch her breath. The evening air felt cool against her face. A few people approached her to thank her for speaking. She smiled politely, trying not to feel overwhelmed. Then she noticed someone standing a few feet away, Officer Henson. He hesitated before walking closer. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I handled that wrong." Alicia looked at him for a moment. She could see that he meant it. His eyes were tired, his posture uneasy. She nodded slightly. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "I hope you take something from it." "I will," he replied. "I already have." There wasn't much more to say. They stood there for a brief, awkward silence, then went their separate ways. That night, Alicia sat on her porch, watching the stars appear one by one. The world still felt heavy, but in a strange way she felt lighter. She couldn't control what had happened, but she could control how she responded. And maybe, just maybe, her calmness had sparked something that would lead to change. Not just in one man, but in a system that needed to see people before judging them. As the crickets chirped and the night grew darker, Alicia took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow will be better." The next few days brought more attention than Alicia ever expected. News stations picked up the story, and clips of the supermarket encounter were replayed on television and shared across social media. Everyone had an opinion. Some people were angry, some were shocked, and others were just deeply saddened that something like that had happened in such a normal, everyday setting. Alicia didn't go looking for the attention. She avoided interviews and didn't post on social media. She didn't want to be the center of another controversy. But she couldn't escape the fact that the story had taken on a life of its own. People began calling her a symbol of calm strength, someone who showed dignity in a moment when anger would have been easy. Still, fame wasn't what she wanted. She just wanted understanding and change. One morning, as she was leaving her house to run errands, she noticed a small envelope taped to her front door. The handwriting was neat, but the name wasn't familiar. She opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter. "Dear Colonel Turner, I work at the same department as the officer who stopped you. I wanted to say that not all of us support what happened that day. Many of us were disturbed when we saw the video. You handled yourself with grace, and I'm truly sorry for how you were treated. Please know that some of us are trying to make things better from within." Alicia folded the letter slowly. It was unsigned, but the words felt genuine. For the first time since the incident, she smiled a little. Maybe not everyone was blind to what had gone wrong. Maybe this could lead to something good after all. Later that week, the local police department announced an official review. They invited community members to attend an open discussion about safety, respect, and how to rebuild trust. Alicia was asked if she would be willing to participate. She thought about it for a long moment before agreeing. The meeting was held in a large hall at the city center. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a quiet buzz filled the air as people entered. There were families, students, retired officers, business owners, and even some veterans who had served under Alicia's command years earlier. The police chief stood at the front, trying to maintain order as reporters set up cameras in the back. When Alicia walked in, the room fell slightly quieter. She didn't wear her uniform, just a simple white blouse and dark pants. She didn't want to appear as a symbol of authority, only as a person who had lived through an uncomfortable truth. As the discussion began, people spoke openly about their feelings. Some expressed anger and frustration. Others spoke about fear of being misunderstood, fear of confrontation. Alicia listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she rose and walked to the microphone. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I didn't come here to accuse anyone," she began. Her voice was calm, steady, and clear. "I came here because what happened to me could happen to anyone. We have to talk about it, not to divide us, but to understand why it keeps happening." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I've served this country for over 2 decades," she continued. "I've worked alongside people from every background imaginable. When you're in the field, no one cares where you're from or what you look like. What matters is respect and trust. That's how people stay safe. That's how people come home alive." The audience listened in silence. Her tone wasn't angry, but every word carried weight. "Here at home, we need that same respect," she said softly. "We need to remember that the uniform doesn't make someone more human than the person standing across from them. It's how we act that shows who we are." A few people nodded. Some clapped quietly. When she sat down, a man from the front row raised his hand. He was middle-aged, wearing a police badge clipped to his belt. "Ma'am," he said, "you're absolutely right. We have to do better. It's hard hearing this, but we need to hear it." Alicia gave him a small nod. "Thank you," she said simply. At the back of the room, Officer Henson sat with his hands folded tightly. He hadn't spoken to anyone since their brief encounter outside the first meeting. The department had placed him on leave while the investigation continued. Every day felt heavier than the one before. Watching Alicia speak that evening only deepened his guilt. He knew he had made assumptions that day. He knew he hadn't handled it right. But seeing her now, calm, collected, still speaking with grace despite what he had done, made him realize how far his actions had reached. It wasn't just about him or her anymore. It was about trust, something far bigger than one mistake. After the meeting, as people left, Henson stayed behind. He approached Alicia as she was gathering her things. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know, I'm learning. I've been doing a lot of thinking." Alicia looked up. "That's good," she said. "That's where change starts." He nodded, unsure what else to say. Then, after a long pause, he added, "I've been ordered to attend bias and de-escalation training. I plan to take it seriously." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a slight smile. "I hope you do. For your sake and for everyone you'll meet after this." That short exchange stayed with him for weeks. Meanwhile, the story continued to grow. National outlets picked it up, turning it into part of a larger conversation about accountability and respect. Alicia was invited to speak at a leadership event for both military and police personnel. The goal wasn't to assign blame, but to share experiences and teach empathy. She hesitated at first. Speaking wasn't her favorite thing, she preferred action. But something inside her told her that her voice could make a difference. The event took place at a local training academy. Young recruits sat in rows, their faces serious, some nervous, some eager. Alicia stood at the front, wearing her uniform this time. The sight of her in it reminded everyone who she was. Not just a woman from a viral video, but someone who had dedicated her life to service. "I want to tell you about something that happened to me," she began. "Not to shame anyone, but to remind you of the power you carry every time you wear that badge." The recruits listened closely. She described the supermarket, the parking lot, and how it felt to be on the receiving end of suspicion. She spoke about fear, not her own, but the kind that makes people act before thinking. When we stop seeing people as people, she said, we stop seeing truth. And when we stop seeing truth, we lose trust, the one thing that keeps every community safe. Her words struck a chord. Afterward, a few trainees approached her privately to thank her. One of them said, "Ma'am, I'll remember that. I promise." That small promise gave Alicia hope, but the story wasn't over yet. Outside the walls of the academy, the investigation into the incident was still ongoing. Every week brought new updates. Internal reports confirmed that Officer Henson had mishandled the situation. There were also older complaints, and nothing violent, but patterns of impatience and bias that the department could no longer ignore. Finally, one afternoon the announcement came. Officer Henson had been dismissed from duty. The department released a public statement saying the decision was made after careful review and consideration of conduct inconsistent with department values. The statement didn't mention Alicia by name, but everyone knew what it was about. When she heard the news, she felt a mix of emotions. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't take joy in his downfall. She simply felt relief, and a quiet sadness that it had to come to this for lessons to be learned. That evening, she went for a walk along the river near her home. The sky was painted orange and gold, the water reflecting the light like glass. A few people recognized her and waved politely. She waved back but kept walking. She thought about how much one moment in a parking lot had changed so many lives. Hers, his, the people who watched, the department that was now rethinking its training. The recruits who had promised to see others more clearly. Change didn't come quickly. It never did, but she knew it had started. When she reached the end of the path, she sat on a bench and watched the water move quietly past. She didn't think about the video anymore or the attention it brought. She thought about what could come next, how to keep the conversation alive, how to help more people learn from what had happened without letting anger lead the way. In that moment, she realized something simple but powerful. Calmness was not weakness. Kindness was not silence. And sometimes the most lasting change begins not with anger but with courage, the quiet kind that stands its ground without shouting. The wind blew softly across the river. Alicia smiled faintly, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "It was worth it." The news about the officer's dismissal spread quickly. For most people, it was just another headline, something to read and scroll past. But for Alicia, it felt heavier than that. She had never wished for anyone to lose their job. Her goal had never been punishment. What she wanted was awareness, a real change in how people saw and treated one another. Still, she understood that consequences were part of growth. Without them, nothing truly changes. Over the next few days, Alicia's phone filled with messages again. Some came from strangers thanking her for standing firm with calmness. Others came from people sharing their own experiences, moments when they too had been treated unfairly, but didn't have the strength to speak up. She read every message carefully, sometimes pausing to reflect, sometimes closing her eyes and whispering a quiet prayer for the people who had written to her. One afternoon, she sat by the window of a small cafe downtown, sipping her tea and watching people walk by. The city seemed to move a little differently now. There were posters in shop windows about respect, equality, and kindness. The local community group had started holding workshops on communication and trust, inspired partly by her story. She didn't think of herself as a hero. She never had. To her, she was just a person who had done what she thought was right in a moment that could have gone very wrong. But as she watched people come together, she realized that maybe, just maybe, something good had grown from that painful day. Later that week, she received an invitation to speak at a nearby university. The event was focused on leadership and responsibility, values she had lived by all her life. She hesitated for a moment before accepting. She wasn't used to being in the public eye like this, but if her story could inspire younger minds to think differently, then it was worth it. When the day came, she stood on stage in a modest lecture hall filled with students, teachers, and local residents. The air buzzed with quiet curiosity. Some people had come because they'd seen the video. Others came because they wanted to understand how one person could remain calm under pressure. She began with a small smile. "Sometimes life gives us tests we never expect," she said, "and how we respond to them shows who we really are." She spoke about that morning at the supermarket, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that made people feel like they were standing there beside her. She described the confusion, the fear, and the deep breath she took to steady herself. She didn't use fancy words or emotional exaggerations. She just told the truth, simply and clearly. "I didn't want to be angry," she said, "because anger would only make things worse. I wanted to show what calm can do. Sometimes calm is stronger than shouting." The students listened quietly, some nodding, some recording her words on their phones. After her talk ended, one young man raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said softly, "how do you stay calm when someone treats you unfairly?" Alicia smiled gently. "It's not easy," she said, "but I remind myself that I can't control what others do, only how I respond. When you stay calm, you stay in control of yourself. That's your power." Her words earned a quiet round of applause. When the event ended, many students came up to shake her hand. Some thanked her for her service. Others simply said, "Thank you for being strong." As she walked back to her car afterward, Alicia felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. She was proud that people were learning, that they cared, but she also wished it hadn't taken something so painful for the lesson to begin. Meanwhile, across town, the former officer Henson was trying to rebuild his life. Losing his job had shaken him to the core. For weeks he avoided going out much. The media coverage had painted him in a harsh light. People whispered when they saw him at the grocery store or walking his dog. Some of his old friends had stopped calling. Others tried to comfort him, but he didn't know what to say to them. He spent long hours thinking, really thinking about what had happened. He realized that his mistake had come from fear and assumption. He had reacted instead of listening. He had let his position give him a false sense of judgment. The realization hurt, but he knew it was the truth. Eventually, he decided to volunteer at a community program for young people who wanted to become officers. He wanted to share his story, not to gain sympathy, but to prevent others from making the same mistake. The first day he showed up, people looked at him with curiosity. They knew who he was. They had seen the news. But when he started to speak, his voice was quiet, honest. "I made a mistake that I'll carry for the rest of my life," he told the group. "I forgot to see the person standing in front of me. I saw a problem instead of a human being. That's where everything went wrong." Some people looked uncomfortable hearing his words, but they listened. His openness surprised them. He didn't try to excuse his actions. He didn't blame anyone else. He just took responsibility. Over time, the tension between Alicia and Henson softened, not because they became friends, but because they both chose understanding over resentment. They represented two sides of a painful moment that had, unexpectedly, become a turning point for an entire town. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The headlines faded, the online discussions quieted down, and new stories filled people's feeds. But in the community where it all began, the change was still visible. Police officers now attended empathy workshops once a month. Local schools invited veterans and community leaders to speak about respect and self-control. And people seemed to talk to one another a little more kindly. One sunny afternoon, Alicia was walking out of a bookstore when a little girl approached her, holding her mother's hand. The girl looked up shyly and said, "Are you the lady from the video?" Alicia smiled and knelt down to her level. "I guess I am," she said. "Did you watch it?" The girl nodded. "My teacher said you were very brave." Alicia's smile softened. "Being brave doesn't always mean fighting," she said. "Sometimes it just means staying calm and kind even when you're scared." The girl's eyes lit up. She nodded seriously as if she understood something important. Her mother thanked Alicia quietly, and they went on their way. Moments like that made Alicia realize that her story had become more than just an incident. It had become a lesson, one that reached people she'd never even met. One evening, she received an invitation from the mayor's office. The city was organizing an award ceremony to honor citizens who had contributed to peace and understanding in the community. Her name was on the list. She didn't think she deserved an award for simply staying calm, but she accepted it with gratitude. At the ceremony, she stood on stage once more, surrounded by applause. She looked out at the crowd, students, officers, families, neighbors, and said quietly, "What happened to me was difficult, but it taught me something powerful. Change begins with how we treat one another when no one is watching." The applause that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was gentle, heartfelt, and filled with respect. After the event, as she was leaving, she noticed someone standing quietly at the back of the room. Henson. He wasn't part of the ceremony, but he had come anyway. He nodded once when she saw him, a silent acknowledgement. She nodded back. No words were needed. When Alicia drove home that night, the city lights reflected softly on her windshield. She felt at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she knew that change, however slow, was real. As she parked in her driveway, she sat for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened since that morning at the supermarket. The fear, the misunderstanding, the outrage, the conversations, and the small but meaningful shifts that had followed. She realized that life has a way of turning even painful experiences into lessons that reach far beyond the moment itself. What had begun as an uncomfortable encounter had grown into a story of accountability, forgiveness, and hope. The night sky was clear and full of stars. Alicia stepped out of the car, looked up, and smiled. She whispered quietly to herself, "Maybe this was meant to happen, not for me, but for everyone who needed to see what calm can do." She walked inside, turned off the lights, and sat by the window, the same way she had months ago after that long day, only this time her heart felt lighter. The pain had turned into purpose, and the silence around her didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. Weeks turned into months, and life seemed to move forward again. The noise from the media had faded, and people had gone back to their routines. But for Alicia, the memory of that day still stayed in the corners of her mind, quiet but present, like a scar that had healed but could still be felt if she thought too deeply about it. She had returned to her duties, traveling often for meetings and training programs. Her calm strength had earned her even more respect in her unit, though she never spoke much about what had happened. To her, it was just another test that life had given her, one she had managed to face without losing herself. One morning, while reviewing some reports in her office, her assistant walked in with a small envelope. It was addressed by hand. No stamps, no return address. Just her name written neatly across the front. She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded letter. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were sincere. "I don't expect forgiveness," it began. "But I want to say thank you for the way you handled everything. You could have destroyed me completely, but you didn't. Because of you, I'm learning how to be better." There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. She folded the letter slowly and sat quietly for a few minutes, staring at it. There was a heaviness in her chest, not of anger, but of reflection. She wasn't sure how to feel. Finally, she smiled softly and whispered, "That's all I wanted." That evening, she went for a walk in the park. The weather was mild and families were scattered around, children laughing, couples sitting on benches, and joggers passing by. The sound of life around her made her heart feel light. She stopped near the lake and looked at the reflection of the setting sun dancing on the water. She realized how much she had changed in the past months. Before the incident, she had been someone who believed in discipline and structure, everything by the book. But now she also believed deeply in grace, understanding, and the importance of connection. The world wasn't just about rules and ranks. It was about people and the small choices they made every day. A few days later, she was invited to a local community center for a small discussion about public trust. It wasn't a big event, just a circle of people from different walks of life. Teachers, shop owners, a few officers, and some students. Alicia didn't plan to speak much, but as the discussion went on, people started asking for her opinion. One woman said, "It's easy to lose trust these days. Every time we turn on the news, there's another story that makes us afraid or angry." Alicia nodded thoughtfully. "That's true," she said. "But trust doesn't just come from systems. It comes from people, from how we treat each other, even in small moments. Change doesn't always start big. Sometimes it starts with one kind act." The group sat quietly for a while after that. Her words had touched them, not because they were fancy or dramatic, but because they were real. After the meeting, a young officer came up to her. He looked nervous. "Ma'am," he said, "I've seen that video. I want you to know not all of us are like that. Some of us really want to do better." Alicia smiled warmly. "I know," she said. "That's why you have to lead by example. The world changes one person at a time." As she drove home that night, her phone buzzed with another message. this time from a local reporter. They wanted to do a follow-up story, not about the incident but about what had happened after. Alicia thought for a long time before replying. She didn't like the idea of being back in the spotlight, but she realized that maybe people needed to hear the part of the story that never made it to the news, the part about growth, forgiveness, and second chances. So she agreed. A week later, she met the reporter at her favorite cafe. They sat by the window, the same one she used to watch people from months ago. The reporter was gentle, respectful, and genuinely curious. Most people expected you to stay angry, the reporter said. But you didn't. Why? Alicia smiled faintly. Because anger doesn't heal anything, she said. It just keeps you stuck in the same place. I didn't want to live my life holding on to that moment. I wanted to move forward, and I wanted others to learn from it too. The interview was published the next week, and it quickly gained attention again. But this time, the tone was different. The headlines weren't about conflict or outrage. They were about forgiveness, growth, and how one act of calm had led to positive changes in an entire community. Messages poured in once more, but they were softer now. Stories of people finding hope in her journey. A retired teacher wrote to say the story had made her reconnect with an old friend after years of silence. A young officer said it made him rethink how he approached people during patrols. It amazed Alicia how far kindness could reach when it came from a sincere place. Meanwhile, Henson, the former officer, continued his quiet work at the youth center. The beginning had been hard, but over time, people started seeing the effort he was putting in. He spoke honestly about his mistakes, and the honesty touched many of the young trainees. Some said his story made them want to join the force with better intentions. One evening, the director of the program called Alicia. I thought you'd like to know, he said. The officer who used to work for the department, he's been helping a lot of kids. He's really changed. Alicia didn't say much, just smiled quietly. That's good, she replied. Later that night, she sat on her porch watching the stars come out one by one. She thought about how life had taken both of them, two strangers, who had crossed paths in a moment of misunderstanding and turned their story into something neither of them could have expected. It wasn't about being right or wrong anymore. It was about learning, evolving, and realizing that every person carries the power to change, both themselves and those around them. Months later, she received another letter. This one came from the community center. It was a collection of short notes from the young people who had listened to both her and Henson speak. One note said, "You taught me not to react with anger." Another said, "I want to be the kind of officer who listens first." And one, written in a child's handwriting, simply said, "Thank you for showing what brave really means." Tears filled Alicia's eyes as she read them. She pressed the papers gently against her chest and smiled. That was what it was all for, not the attention, not the recognition, but the quiet change in people's hearts. In the following months, she continued to be invited to talk at small gatherings and leadership sessions. Each time she told her story, not to relive the moment, but to remind people that calmness can be powerful and understanding can be life-changing. Her message became simple. See people as people first. Don't let fear make decisions for you, and somehow, that simple message began to travel. Through word of mouth, through short clips online, through conversations among families and friends. One day, a friend called her, laughing softly. "You've gone viral again," they said. Alicia chuckled. "This time for the right reasons, I hope." It was true. The video of her interview had been shared by community groups across the country, not as a story of conflict, but as one of peace and maturity. Through it all, Alicia remained grounded. She still woke up early, did her morning run, drank her tea, and read her favorite books. She didn't chase fame or attention. She just kept living her life with quiet purpose, believing that real change doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be real. And in that quiet, steady way, her story kept inspiring people long after the cameras had turned away. Months had passed since the world first heard about the supermarket incident. The story that once caused outrage had slowly transformed into something else. A quiet lesson that people carried with them in small ways. Life had moved on, but the impact was still there, rippling softly through the town and beyond. Alicia's days had become peaceful again. She had returned to her normal routines. waking up early, taking her morning walks, attending meetings, and spending quiet evenings at home with her thoughts. But even as her life regained its calm rhythm, something inside her had changed forever. She had seen the worst and the best of human behavior. She had seen fear, misunderstanding, anger, but she had also seen growth, compassion, and redemption. That experience had reshaped how she saw people. No matter how flawed, everyone carried the potential to learn, to change, and to heal. One afternoon, she was invited to attend a small award ceremony at a local high school. The students had been studying real-life examples of leadership and integrity, and her story had been one of them. She hesitated at first. She didn't see herself as a symbol of anything. But she agreed to come, not for herself, but for the students who might need a message of strength and kindness. When she arrived, the auditorium was filled with young faces. Some whispered to one another. Others waved shyly when they saw her. The principal welcomed her warmly and handed her a small plaque that read, "For Courage and Calm." The room clapped, and Alicia smiled softly. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone and looked around at the students. Their faces reminded her of the future, a generation that could build something better if they chose to. "I'm not here because I did something special," she began in her steady, gentle voice. "I'm here because I stayed calm when I could have reacted differently. Sometimes strength doesn't come from shouting or fighting. Sometimes it comes from being still, thinking clearly, and choosing kindness even when it's hard." The students listened closely. You could feel the quiet respect in the room. One young girl in the front row wiped her eyes as Alicia spoke. "When you go through something difficult," Alicia continued, "you have two choices. You can let it make you bitter, or you can let it make you better. The moment you choose better, that's when you really win." When she finished, the students stood up and clapped. Some came up afterward to thank her personally. One boy said, "My dad told me about your story. He said you showed how patience can save a life." Alicia smiled at him, touched by his sincerity. "Your dad's right," she said. "Patience isn't weakness. It's control." After the ceremony, she sat alone in her car for a while before driving home. She thought about how strange life could be, how one moment could change everything, not just for her, but for so many others. The incident had started as something painful, yet it had grown into something powerful and meaningful. As the months continued, Alicia began working with a small organization, focused on building trust between communities and law enforcement. It wasn't a big or fancy role. She wasn't seeking recognition, but it allowed her to quietly help others learn what she had learned. She often met with groups of officers, new recruits, and community leaders. During one of the sessions, a young trainee asked her, "Do you think people can really change after making a big mistake?" Alicia thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said softly, "if they truly want to. But it takes humility, and it takes time. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it's possible. I've seen it." She meant it. She had seen it firsthand. Not long after, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from the director of the community center again. He told her that the former officer, the same one from that day, had been chosen to help lead a new outreach program focused on empathy and communication. It was a small but meaningful position, one that showed how far he had come. The director added, "He wanted me to let you know he's grateful. He said your calmness saved him from becoming someone worse." Alicia didn't know what to say at first. She sat in silence, taking in the words. Then she said quietly, "Tell him I'm glad he found his way." After hanging up, she walked out to her garden. The air was fresh and the sound of birds filled the quiet. She looked around at the flowers she had planted months ago. They had grown strong, blooming in soft colors under the afternoon sun. She knelt down and brushed her fingers across the petals, thinking about how growth takes time and patience, but it always comes if you nurture it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alicia sat by her window, her favorite spot. She thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the misunderstanding, the outrage, the conversations that followed, and the change that had quietly taken root. She realized that life isn't always about the big moments. It's about what you do afterward, how you respond, how you grow, and how you choose to move forward. A few weeks later, the same reporter who had interviewed her months ago reached out again. This time they weren't asking for a story. They just wanted to share an update. Your story is being used in training programs now, the reporter said over the phone. Departments across the country are using it as an example of how calm can prevent tragedy. Alicia didn't say much, just smiled quietly. That means a lot, she replied. If it helps even one person think differently, then it's worth it. After the call, she looked out the window again. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold, the kind of sunset that made you stop and appreciate the beauty and stillness. She thought about how far she had come, not just in distance, but in spirit. The world could be harsh and unfair, but it could also be kind and forgiving. It all depended on the choices people made. Later that night, she took out the letter she had received months earlier, the one from the former officer. She kept it folded neatly in a small box along with other personal things. She read it once more, then placed it back gently. She didn't keep it as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of change. Proof that even broken things can be repaired if someone is willing to try. Before going to bed, she wrote in her journal, something she had started doing since the incident. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just makes space for the future." She closed the journal, turned off the light, and lay down. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely at peace. The next morning, the sun rose quietly, just like every day. Alicia got dressed, put on her running shoes, and stepped outside. The air was cool and calm. As she jogged down the familiar path through her neighborhood, people waved at her. The same neighbors who had once whispered after the incident. Now they greeted her with warmth. She smiled back at them. Life had come full circle. By the time she reached the park, the sun had climbed higher, filling everything with golden light. She stopped by the lake again, the same place where she once stood months ago, lost in thought. The water shimmered gently, and she could see her reflection clearly now, strong, steady, and at peace. She whispered quietly to herself, "Everything happens for a reason," and in that moment, she felt grateful, not for what had happened, but for what it had taught her. Sometimes, the hardest moments lead to the most important lessons. Sometimes calmness is the real strength, and sometimes, a single act of grace can change more lives than you'll ever know. Alicia stood there for a while, watching the sunlight dance on the water, before turning to walk back home, calm, steady, and stronger than ever.